"Don't look at my arms," she cried, but the mountain man lifted her sleeves and froze in terror. Snow pounds against a lonely shack in the Colorado highlands. A hardened frontiersman pulls a half-dead woman from the storm, only to uncover scars so cruel they stop him cold. Scars carved by men who once rode with him. Shadows from a past he buried. By the glow of a single lantern, she whispers of a preacher's chains and a paper that binds her name to his own bloodline. Now the law rides against them, church bells tolling, rifles cocked, hooves pounding through the night. But in a town where justice can be bought, can one broken woman's voice and one mountain man's faith turn the tide? Or will the truth buried in her scars condemn them both forever? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The mountain cabin creaked under the weight of fresh snow. Marcus McCord stirred in his chair, his neck stiff from sleeping upright. The fire had burned low during the night, casting weak shadows on the rough-hewn walls. His Winchester rifle lay heavy across his lap, a familiar comfort in an unfamiliar situation. The bundle of quilts by the hearth moved slightly. The young woman he'd found in the snow was still there, not some strange dream conjured by too many lonely winters. Her face looked peaceful now, though worry lines creased her forehead even in sleep. Dark circles underneath her eyes told of exhaustion beyond just one night in the cold. Marcus eased out of his chair, setting the rifle aside with practiced care. The floorboards protested beneath his boots as he moved to add wood to the dying fire. Each log he placed made the flames leap higher, bringing welcome warmth back to the cabin's single room. The woman stirred at the sound of crackling pine. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear flashing across her face as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. She clutched the quilts tighter, pulling them up to her chin. "You're safe here," Marcus said softly, keeping his distance. He'd seen that look of terror before, in wounded animals backed into corners. "Name's Marcus McCord. Found you outside my cabin last night, nearly frozen." She swallowed hard, her throat working as she found her voice. "Louisa," she whispered. "Louisa Kincaid." Marcus nodded, moving slowly to the iron stove where a pot of coffee simmered. "Reckon you could use something warm to drink, Miss Kincaid." He poured the dark liquid into a tin cup, setting it on the floor within her reach before stepping back. Louisa's hands trembled as she reached for the cup, careful to keep the quilts covering her arms. The steam rose in delicate curls as she breathed in the aroma. "Thank you, Mr. McCord." "Marcus is fine." He settled back in his chair, deliberately keeping his movements slow and predictable. "Storm's still blowing out there. You're welcome to stay until it passes." Fear flickered in her eyes again. I can't impose. You've already been too kind." "Ain't no imposition, wouldn't turn anyone out in weather like this." Marcus paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Don't mean to pry, but these mountains ain't kind to folks wandering without purpose. You running from something, Miss Kincaid?" Louisa's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "Or someone," she whispered, so quiet he almost missed it. Marcus felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice gentle. "Whoever it is, they won't find you here. Not in this weather, and not unless you want to be found." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You don't know what he's capable of, what he's already done." Her free hand unconsciously rubbed at her sleeve. "No, I don't," Marcus agreed. "But I know these mountains better than any man alive, and I know how to keep folks safe when they need keeping." He stood slowly, moving to the window where snow still fell in heavy curtains. "Way this storm's blowing, we've got at least 2 days before anyone could make it up this high. Plenty of time to figure things out." Louisa sipped her coffee, shoulders gradually relaxing as the warmth spread through her. "Why are you helping me? You don't know anything about me." Marcus turned from the window, his weathered face softening. "Known plenty of folks who needed help and didn't get it. Made a promise to myself long ago not to be the kind of man who turns away." "There aren't many like you left," Louisa said quietly. "Most people, they don't want to get involved. They look the other way. Ain't right looking away when someone's hurting. Marcus moved to the stove, stirring a pot of beans that had been warming. You feel up to eating something? Nothing fancy, but it's hot. Louisa nodded, though her movements remained cautious as she adjusted her position by the fire. Every shift of her arms seemed to cause her pain, though she tried to hide it. Marcus filled a bowl with beans and cornbread, setting it near her like he had with the coffee. As he straightened, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold, a thin line of scarring peeking out from beneath her sleeve. He turned away quickly, remembering her whispered plea from the night before. Don't look at my arms. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture that made his stomach turn. Someone had hurt this woman, hurt her badly enough to leave scars, and she was still running from them. Weather like this always reminds me of my first winter up here, Marcus said, deliberately changing the subject as he settled back in his chair. Wasn't prepared for how fierce these mountains can get. Nearly froze to death myself till an old Ute hunter found me, taught me everything I know about surviving up here. Louisa looked up from her bowl, interest flickering in her eyes. You've lived here long? Going on 15 years now. Marcus gazed into the fire, memories playing across his face. Was a different man when I first came up here. Angry, lost, running from my own troubles, you might say. What changed? Louisa asked softly. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering. Found peace in the silence, I reckon. These mountains, they have a way of showing you what's important. Strip away all the noise and mess of the world below. He looked at her directly. Sometimes the Lord puts people in our path for a reason, Miss Kincaid. Whether it's an old Ute hunter saving a fool from freezing or a stranger taking in someone lost in the snow, Louisa finished, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Something like that. Marcus stood, gathering their empty cups. You should rest more. Body needs time to recover from cold like that. Louisa nodded, settling back into the quilts. Mr. McCord? Marcus? She waited until he turned to face her. Thank you, not just for the shelter, but for not asking questions I'm not ready to answer. Marcus inclined his head. Rest easy, Miss Kincaid, you're safe here. As Louisa drifted back to sleep, Marcus returned to his window vigil. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, blanketing the world in white silence. His thoughts turned to the scars he'd glimpsed, to the fear in her eyes, to whatever monster of a man had driven her to flee into a winter storm. His hand drifted to the rifle, checking its familiar weight. He'd left violence behind years ago, found a different path in these mountains. But as he watched Louisa's troubled sleep, Marcus McCord knew with certainty that he'd pick up that rifle again if needed. Some things were worth protecting, some battles worth fighting. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's bones, but inside the fire burned steady and warm. Marcus settled back into his chair, prepared for another night of watching. Whatever storm was coming, whether from the sky or from Louisa's past, he'd face it head on. The mountains had taught him patience, taught him to read the signs of coming trouble. And there was trouble coming, sure as snow in winter. He could feel it in his bones, same way he could feel a storm building days before it broke. But for now, in this moment, his cabin was a sanctuary, a place of safety in a world that had shown this young woman precious little kindness. Marcus added another log to the fire, watching the sparks dance upward. The flames cast a protective glow over Louisa's sleeping form, and he offered up a silent prayer, the first in many years, asking for guidance in whatever lay ahead. The storm raged on outside, but within those cabin walls, a fragile peace held steady. Two souls, each carrying their own wounds, found themselves thrown together by providence or chance. As the night deepened, Marcus kept his quiet vigil, rifle across his lap, while Louisa slept the deep sleep of the truly exhausted. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now this was enough. This moment of sanctuary, of simple kindness offered without question or demand. The mountains had taught Marcus the value of such moments, the importance of shelter from life's storms, both physical and spiritual. He settled deeper into his chair, eyes never straying far from the cabin door. Whatever darkness had driven Louisa Kincaid to his doorstep, it would find no easy entry here, not while Marcus McCord drew breath. The fire crackled softly, casting its warm light through the cabin, while outside, the snow continued to fall, building drifts that would keep the world at bay for days to come. In that peaceful moment, it seemed perhaps Providence had known exactly what it was doing, bringing these two wounded souls together in the vast wilderness of the Colorado Highlands. The morning sun struggled through heavy clouds, casting weak light across the snow-blanketed landscape. Inside the cabin, Marcus McCord moved quietly, not wanting to wake his unexpected guest. He added wood to the dying embers, bringing the fire back to crackling life. The familiar routine of morning chores helped settle his mind after a night of troubled thoughts. He gathered ingredients for a hearty stew, dried venison, wrinkled potatoes from his root cellar, and the last of his carrots. The cabin filled with the rich aroma of cooking meat and vegetables as he worked. Every few minutes his eyes drifted to the sleeping woman bundled in quilts near the fireplace. She hadn't stirred much since dawn. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, speaking of exhaustion, bone deep and raw. The storm had passed, but drifts of fresh snow pressed against the cabin walls, sealing them in white silence. When the stew was ready, Marcus approached her sleeping form carefully. "Miss?" he called softly, keeping his distance. "Got some hot food if you're feeling up to it." Louisa stirred, blinking against the pale morning light. Fear flickered across her face before recognition set in. "What time is it?" she asked, voice rough with sleep. "Just past 8 in the morning," Marcus answered, stepping back to give her space. "Storm's blown itself out, but we're proper snowed in for a spell." She sat up slowly, wincing. Her clothes were still damp from yesterday, hanging awkwardly on her thin frame. Marcus had laid out some spare clothes the night before, an old shirt and trousers that would be too big but at least dry. "Name's Marcus McCord," he said, ladling stew into a bowl. "Figured proper introductions were due, seeing as you were hardly conscious when you arrived." She accepted the bowl with trembling hands, careful to avoid any contact. "Louisa Kincaid," she replied softly. Thank you for taking me in." Marcus settled into his chair, giving her plenty of room. No thanks needed. Couldn't leave anyone out in weather like that. He watched as she struggled to hold the spoon steady. "Those wrappings on your wrists need changing. Got some clean bandages if you'll allow." Louisa's grip tightened on the bowl. "I can manage," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Infection's nothing to trifle with, especially up here," Marcus said gently. "Mountain winters are harsh enough without fever setting in." She stared into her stew, conflict clear on her face. Finally, she gave a small nod, though her whole body tensed as Marcus approached with fresh bandages. He moved slowly, telegraphing each action. "I'll be careful," he promised. "Just want to make sure you're healing proper." As he began unwrapping the sodden bandages, his breath caught. Beneath the dirty cloth, angry welts crossed her wrists, lash marks, deep and cruel. The kind of marks he'd seen before, years ago, when he'd run with men who enjoyed causing pain. Louisa tried to pull away, but Marcus held steady. With gentle determination, he pushed back her sleeves. What he saw made his stomach turn. Scars, old and new, covered her arms. Some were straight lines from a knife, others the distinctive round marks of burns. These weren't random injuries. This was methodical torture, carried out with terrible purpose. Marcus froze, recognition hitting him like a physical blow. He knew this style of cruelty, had witnessed it firsthand in his darker days. The gang he'd once belonged to had specialized in such calculated brutality. Louisa yanked her arms back, tears streaming down her face. "Now you know," she choked out. "I understand if you want me to leave. I know how disgusting they are." "No," Marcus said firmly, kneeling before her. "You're not going anywhere, not unless you choose to. You're safe here." She looked at him in disbelief, arms crossed protectively over her chest. "How can you even look at them?" "At me? These marks, they're—" "Because scars don't tell me who you are," Marcus interrupted softly. "They only tell me what you endured. And surviving something like that? That takes more courage than most folks will ever know." Fresh tears spilled down Louisa's cheeks, but something in her posture eased slightly. You really mean that? Every word. Marcus stood slowly, retrieving the clean bandages. Now, will you let me tend to these properly? Then we can see about getting you into some dry clothes. This time, Louisa extended her arms without resistance. Marcus worked carefully, cleaning each wound before applying salve and fresh wrappings. Neither spoke as he worked, but the silence felt different now, less fearful, more like the quiet understanding between people who recognize pain in each other. The day passed slowly, marked by the steady tick of Marcus's old clock and the gradual shift of sunlight across snow-covered windows. Louisa changed into the spare clothes, the oversized garments making her seem even smaller. She dozed off and on, her body still recovering from exposure and exhaustion. As evening approached, Marcus lit the oil lamp, its warm glow pushing back the growing darkness. He prepared a simple supper of cornbread and the leftover stew, setting a bowl near Louisa where she sat wrapped in quilts. "Think you might be ready to tell me what brought you up this mountain?" he asked carefully, settling into his chair. Louisa stared into the fire, silent for so long Marcus thought she wouldn't answer. "I ran," she finally said, voice barely above a whisper. "Had to. He would have killed me eventually." Marcus nodded, not pressing for details. "Reckon you did what needed doing, then." "I didn't know where I was going," she continued. "Just kept moving, trying to stay ahead of them. The storm caught me by surprise. I saw your cabin light through the snow and—" She trailed off, shuddering at the memory. "Providence has its ways," Marcus said quietly. "Sometimes leads us right where we need to be, even when we don't know where that is." Louisa looked at him thoughtfully. "You sound like you know something about running." "Done my share," he admitted. "These mountains, they became my refuge 15 years back. Left some dark things behind, found a different way to live." They sat in companionable silence as the lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind whispered through snow-laden pines, but inside the cabin was warm and still. "Will you tell me about them?" Louisa asked suddenly. "The mountains, I mean. What it's like living up here." Marcus smiled slightly, recognizing her need to think about something, anything, other than what she'd fled. He began describing the changing seasons, the ways of wildlife, the secrets of survival he'd learned over the years. Louisa listened intently, asking questions now and then, her tense shoulders gradually relaxing. As night deepened, the conversation drifted naturally into comfortable silence. The cabin's warmth wrapped around them like a protective blanket, holding the winter world at bay. Louisa's eyes grew heavy, though she fought against sleep. "Rest," Marcus told her gently. "You're safe here. I give you my word." She nodded, already drifting off. Marcus added wood to the fire, watching the flames leap higher. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, this moment of peace was enough. The lamp burned low as Marcus kept his quiet vigil, rifle close at hand. Through the window, stars peeked between breaking clouds, their cold light glinting off endless fields of snow. Inside, Louisa slept soundly for the first time since arriving, her face finally peaceful in the firelight. The night deepened and the cabin held its warmth, a small island of safety in the vast wilderness. Marcus settled deeper into his chair, grateful that Providence had guided this wounded soul to his door. Some burdens were easier to bear when shared, some healing only possible when someone else stood guard against the darkness. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows as Marcus stoked the fire back to life. The cabin slowly warmed, chasing away the night's chill. Louisa stirred beneath her quilts, looking better rested than she had the day before. Some color had returned to her cheeks, though shadows still lingered under her eyes. "Morning," Marcus said quietly, not wanting to startle her. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she replied, pushing herself up to sitting. "Stronger, I think." Marcus nodded, pleased to see her steadier. "Reckon some breakfast would help with that. Got some dried apples we can stew up. Maybe some flapjacks if you're of a mind to eat proper." I'd like to help, Louisa offered, standing carefully. I don't want to be a burden. No burden, Marcus assured her, but he recognized the need to feel useful. Though, if you're willing, these potatoes need peeling for later. Should be easy enough on those wrists. He retrieved a basket of potatoes and his spare knife, setting them near her chair. Louisa settled in, handling the knife with surprising skill despite her injured wrists. As she worked, a soft humming filled the cabin, the melody of an old hymn, though her voice trembled slightly. Marcus paused in his breakfast preparations, the familiar tune stirring something deep inside him. How long had it been since he'd thought of such things? Since he'd let himself remember the faith of his younger days? The simple sound of Louisa's humming brought back memories of Sunday services, of his mother's voice raised in praise, of times before darkness had claimed so much of his life. They worked in companionable silence, broken only by the quiet song and the scrape of the peeling knife. The domestic scene felt strange to Marcus after so many years alone, yet somehow right, natural, like the cabin had been waiting for such moments. As morning stretched toward noon, Louisa's movements grew more confident. She finished the potatoes and insisted on helping with other tasks, sweeping the floor, washing dishes, small things that seemed to help settle her nerves. But Marcus noticed how she kept glancing at the windows, how she startled at sudden sounds from outside. "No one comes up here much," he said finally, hoping to ease her mind, "especially not in weather like this." Louisa's hands stilled on the dish she was drying. "I keep expecting—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Marcus set down the coffee pot he'd been cleaning. "Might help to speak it," he suggested gently. "Whatever's haunting you." She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He called himself Reverend Blackthorne. A traveling preacher, he said, claimed he was doing God's work, reforming lost souls. Her hands trembled as she set down the dish. "My father had just died. I was alone, no family left. The Reverend offered me a position, said I could help with his ministry, teach reading to children when we stopped in towns." Marcus listened silently, his jaw tightening as he guessed where this tale was heading. "At first it seemed fine. We traveled, held services, but then—" Louisa wrapped her arms around herself as if warding off a chill. "He started saying I needed reform myself, that my father had raised me wrong, filled my head with too many ideas, said it was his duty to correct me." She drew a shaky breath. The beating started small, a switch across the hands for reading the wrong passages. Then it got worse. He'd use his belt or heat knife blades in the fire, said he was burning out my wickedness. Tears slid down her cheeks. All while preaching about God's love to others. No one knew what happened in private. He made sure of that. Marcus's hands had clenched into fists, but he forced them to relax. His anger wouldn't help her now. "3 days ago, I couldn't take any more," Louisa continued. "He was drunk, passed out in his tent. I took what food I could carry and ran. Didn't know where I was going, just headed for the mountains. Thought maybe he wouldn't follow up here." She looked up at Marcus, fear clear in her eyes. "But he will. He'll look for me. He says I belong to him now, that God gave me into his keeping." Marcus moved slowly, deliberately, until he stood before her. "Listen close now," he said, his voice low and fierce. "That man is no reverend. What he did wasn't God's work. It was evil, plain and simple. And I swear to you, Louisa Kincaid, he won't lay a hand on you again. Not while I draw breath." Louisa's composure finally broke. She leaned forward, her forehead touching Marcus's shoulder as she wept. He stood perfectly still, offering the strength of his presence without demanding anything in return. After a moment, she straightened, wiping her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, for not turning me away." "Ain't nothing to thank me for," Marcus replied gruffly, moving back to give her space. "Just doing what's right." The day wore on, snow continuing to fall in lazy spirals outside the windows. The constant white curtain gave the cabin a sense of isolation, as if they were on an island far removed from the rest of the world. Marcus kept busy with indoor tasks, mending traps, checking his supplies, anything to keep his hands occupied while his mind worked through all Louisa had revealed. As evening approached, he began preparing their supper. The familiar routine helped settle his thoughts, though anger still simmered beneath the surface. Not the hot, violent anger of his younger days, but something deeper, a cold fury at the evil men could do in God's name. When the food was ready, Marcus found himself doing something he hadn't done in 15 years. Without really planning to, he bowed his head and began to pray aloud. "Lord," he said roughly, "been a long time since I spoke to you proper. Reckon I got no right to start now, but—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Thank you for leading this child to safety. Help me do right by her. And Lord, help me remember that vengeance is yours, not mine." He looked up to find Louisa watching him, tears shining in her eyes again, but different this time. Not tears of fear or pain, but of something like hope. Though she still glanced nervously at the windows, some of the tension had eased from her shoulders. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the soft tick of the clock and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling all sound, creating a pocket of peace in the gathering dusk. The cabin felt like a sanctuary now, not just a shelter, a place where healing might begin, where faith long buried might take root again. Marcus watched Louisa as she finished her meal, noting how she sat straighter now, how her hands shook less. She had a long road ahead, he knew. Scars like hers, both visible and hidden, took time to heal. But she had something now she hadn't had before, safety and someone to stand guard while she found her strength again. The snow fell steadily, adding another layer to the white blanket outside. But inside the cabin, warmth held steady, and two souls who had known darkness found comfort in shared light. The days passed quietly in the snow-wrapped cabin. Each morning brought a little more color to Louisa's cheeks, a little more steadiness to her hands. Marcus watched her recovery with quiet satisfaction, noting how she moved with growing confidence around his humble home. On the fourth morning after finding her, Marcus rose before dawn. The woodpile was getting low, and with Louisa's presence, he needed to keep the fire burning stronger than usual. He pulled on his heavy coat and gloves, watching as early light crept through the frost-laced windows. "I'll be heading out to chop more wood," he told Louisa as she stirred from her bedroll near the hearth. "Shouldn't be gone more than a few hours. You'll be all right?" Louisa nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'll keep busy. Maybe straighten up a bit if you don't mind." "Suit yourself," Marcus replied, though the thought of someone touching his things made him slightly uneasy. Still, he couldn't deny the cabin looked better for her careful attention these past few days. "Just don't strain yourself none." He hitched up his old mule, loaded the axe and rope, and set out through the deep snow. The morning air bit sharp and clean, and his breath clouded before him as he made his way to a stand of dry pine he'd marked earlier that season. Back in the cabin, Louisa moved methodically through her self-appointed tasks. She'd always found comfort in order, in making spaces clean and welcoming. It gave her hands purpose and her mind peace. She swept the rough wooden floor, organized Marcus's meager collection of tin plates and cups, and folded the few spare blankets into neat squares. Near midday, she noticed a wooden box tucked beneath Marcus's bed. It was plain but well made, the kind meant for keeping precious things safe. Dust had settled thick on its lid. Louisa hesitated, knowing she shouldn't pry, but something about the box called to her. Perhaps it was the way it sat alone, nearly hidden, like it held memories too painful to look at but too precious to throw away. "I'll just dust it," she whispered to herself, reaching for the box. But as she lifted it, the lid shifted, and several items spilled onto the floor. A wooden toy horse, worn smooth by small hands, a daguerreotype of a stern-faced woman in an old-fashioned dress, and beneath these a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. Louisa's fingers trembled as she picked up the paper. She knew she should put it back, but something about its official appearance made her unfold it. The moment she saw the heading, her heart seemed to stop. Marriage license. Her eyes scanned the document and the blood drained from her face. There, in faded ink, was a name she had hoped never to see again. Joseph McCord. And beside it, her own signature, forced from her hand months ago under threat of violence. The paper slipped from her numb fingers. She remembered that day with horrible clarity, Reverend Blackthorne pressing the pen into her hand, Joseph McCord's lazy smile as he watched her sign, the preacher's words about how this would ensure her proper submission to authority. No ceremony had ever taken place, but they had made her sign, had used it as one more chain to bind her. But McCord, Marcus's surname. Could it be? The door creaked open, sending her heart into her throat. Marcus stomped in, shaking snow from his boots. He stopped short when he saw her face. "Louisa, what's wrong?" She couldn't speak, could only point to the paper on the floor. Marcus crossed the room in 3 long strides, picked up the document, and went completely still. "I'm sorry," Louisa whispered. "I shouldn't have looked. I was just cleaning, and the box fell." She hugged herself tightly, fighting back tears. "Please, you have to believe me. I never married him, not really. They forced me to sign, but there was no ceremony, no." "Joseph," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. "My brother." The word hung in the air between them like frost. Louisa watched as Marcus's face darkened with a shame that seemed to age him years in moments. "Your brother?" she echoed faintly. Marcus sank heavily into his chair by the fire, the paper crumpling in his grip. "My younger brother. Haven't seen him in 5 years. Not since—" He shook his head. Should have known he'd be mixed up in something like this. Always was careless with promises, with people's lives. "I didn't know," Louisa said quickly, desperate to explain. "The preacher brought him one day, said God had chosen him for me. When I refused—" She pulled her sleeves down instinctively over her scars. "They said the license would make sure I couldn't run, that I belonged to them now." Marcus's knuckles whitened around the paper. "My own blood," he muttered. "Helping that devil hurt an innocent woman." He looked up at her, and the pain in his eyes made her heart ache. "Louisa, I swear I never knew. If I had—" "Please," she interrupted, taking a step toward him. "Please don't think I tried to deceive you. I didn't know you were his brother. I never wanted any of this." "No," Marcus said firmly. "Don't you apologize. None of this is your doing." He stood abruptly and began to pace, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "It's the McCord shame following me, even up here. Thought I'd left it all behind, but Joseph—" He stopped, staring into the fire. "Always was wild, but this? Helping that preacher torture a woman under the guise of marriage?" Louisa watched him pace, seeing the conflict written in every line of his body. The discovery had shaken him deeply. She could see it in the way his hands clenched and unclenched, the way his eyes kept darting to the paper he'd set on the table. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Marcus ran a hand through his graying hair. "That paper, it's legal enough to cause trouble. If that preacher comes looking, he could claim rights over you through Joseph. Law might even back him, not knowing the truth of it." "No," Louisa breathed, terror clawing at her throat. "Please, I can't go back. I'd rather die than—" "Easy now," Marcus said quickly, his voice gentling. "Wasn't saying I'd let that happen. Just trying to reckon out what we're facing." The day faded into evening, but neither of them felt much like eating. Louisa sat curled in her blanket by the fire, while Marcus continued his restless pacing. Every creak of the cabin's timbers made her jump, imagining Reverend Blackthorne's heavy step on the porch. As night deepened, Louisa finally drifted into uneasy sleep, but Marcus couldn't find rest. He stood at the window, watching moonlight glint off the snow, his mind churning with dark thoughts. The marriage license lay on the table like a snake in their midst, a reminder that his brother's reckless ways could still reach out and poison innocent lives. He thought of Joseph, the wild younger brother he'd tried so hard to guide right, who'd always chosen the easy path over the honest one. Now Joseph's carelessness had entangled him with Louisa's fate, complicated what should have been a simple matter of protecting someone in need. The fire popped and settled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Marcus paced from window to door, checking the latch for the 10th time. He knew sleep wouldn't come tonight, not with these thoughts plaguing him. Part of him wanted to burn that paper, destroy any legal claim Joseph or the preacher might have. But that might only make things worse if the law got involved. He looked over at Louisa's sleeping form, noting how even in sleep she kept her scarred arms tucked close, protecting herself. The sight strengthened his resolve. Whatever came, he wouldn't let his brother's recklessness or that false preacher's cruelty harm her again. But the path ahead seemed darker now, tangled with complications he hadn't expected when he first found her in the snow. The night wore on, and still Marcus paced, torn between duty and fear, between protecting Louisa and dreading how the McCord name might taint them both if this came to light. The fire burned low, and the wind whistled through the eaves, carrying with it the weight of decisions yet to be made. The morning dawned bright and clear, the storm's fury finally spent. Sunlight sparkled on fresh snow, and the air held that peculiar stillness that comes after days of winter wind. Marcus stood at his cabin door, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The break in weather meant they needed to fetch water. The barrel was running low after nearly a week trapped inside. "Reckon it's safe enough to venture to the creek now," he said, turning to where Louisa sat mending one of his old shirts. "Would you care to join me? Might do you good to get some fresh air." Louisa set aside her needlework, hesitation crossing her face. "Are you sure it's safe?" "Snow's deep enough to slow any riders," Marcus assured her. "And I know every sound these mountains make. We'll hear trouble long before it finds us." She nodded slowly, rising to wrap herself in the thick wool coat he'd given her. It was too big, but the extra layers would keep her warm. Marcus gathered 2 wooden buckets and led the way, breaking trail through knee-deep snow. The creek lay about a quarter-mile from the cabin, hidden in a small ravine. As they descended the gentle slope, Louisa gasped softly. The scene before them was transformed into something magical. Ice crystals hung from bare branches like diamond chains, and the creek itself was bordered by fantastic sculptures of frozen spray. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. Marcus watched her face, noting how the fear that usually shadowed her expression had lifted. For just a moment she looked young again, enchanted by the simple glory of winter's artistry. Something in his chest tightened at the sight. They made their way carefully to the creek's edge. Where the water ran fastest, it remained open despite the cold, gurgling beneath shelves of ice. Marcus showed Louisa how to break through the thinner ice at the edge to fill their buckets. "The water tastes sweeter here than anywhere else I've known," he said, watching her dip her bucket carefully. "Comes straight down from the high country, pure as prayer." A smile touched Louisa's lips, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "My father used to say mountain water was God's own tea," she said softly, then fell silent, lost in memory. They had just finished filling the second bucket when Marcus's head snapped up. His hand shot out, gripping Louisa's arm in warning. She froze, terror flooding back into her face. "What?" she began to whisper, but he pressed a finger to his lips. There, carried on the still air, the distinctive sound of hoofbeats crunching through snow. Multiple horses, moving steady but not fast, like men searching. Marcus's mind raced through options. The cabin was too far to reach unseen, but his tool shed stood closer, just up the slope. He grabbed both buckets in one hand and Louisa's arm with the other. "Quick now," he murmured. "Behind the shed. Move quiet as you can." They hurried through the snow, Marcus choosing their steps carefully to leave as little trail as possible. They reached the shed just as the riders came into view on the ridge above. 3 men, bundled against the cold, rifles across their saddles. Louisa pressed against Marcus's side, trembling violently. Her fingers dug into his arm as she whispered, "The preacher's men. The one in front, that's Silas. He does the hunting." Marcus felt her terror and kept his arm around her shoulders, steadying her as they watched through a gap between the shed's rough boards. The riders paused on the ridge, scanning the valley below. The leader, Silas, pointed toward the creek and they turned their horses that way. "Tracks here?" one called out. "Fresh ones?" "Could be the trapper," another responded. "Heard tell of one living up this way." Silas spat into the snow. "Check 'em anyway. Reverend wants every trail followed." Marcus held perfectly still, grateful that the shed's weather-grade boards blended with the winter-bare trees behind it. The riders examined the creek bank, then continued down the valley, their voices fading with distance. Only when the hoofbeats had completely disappeared did Marcus release his breath. Louisa sagged against him, her whole body shaking. "They're hunting me," she whispered, "like I'm some kind of animal." "They won't find you," Marcus said firmly, though his mind was already calculating the danger. 3 men now, but there would be more, and they were systematic in their search. This was no casual pursuit. They waited several more minutes before Marcus deemed it safe to move. They hurried back to the cabin, all thoughts of the creek's beauty forgotten. Inside, Marcus immediately began checking his weapons. First his Winchester rifle, then the Colt single-action revolver he kept cleaned but had hoped never to need. Louisa watched him count out spare cartridges with shaking hands. "They'll have papers," she said quietly. "The marriage license wasn't the only document they made me sign. The preacher, he knows how to make things look legal and proper." Marcus nodded grimly, setting aside the cleaned rifle. "Frontier law's a flexible thing out here. Man with the right papers and a convincing manner can sometimes bend justice his way." He looked at her steadily. "But that doesn't make it right. And I mean to stand between you and any harm they'd bring, papers or no papers." Tears welled in Louisa's eyes. "Why would you risk yourself for me? You barely know me." "I know enough," Marcus replied simply. "Know you're a soul in need of protection, and that's all that matters." The day passed tensely, both of them starting at every sound from the forest. As evening approached, they sat before the fire, the weight of danger heavy in the air. Louisa stared into the flames, absently rubbing her scarred arms through her sleeves. "Marcus," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I ask you something?" He looked up from cleaning his revolver. "Of course. Do you think—" She paused, struggling with the words. "Do you think God can forgive scars that come from sin? Even if it wasn't sin you chose?" Marcus set aside his work, considering her question carefully. He thought of his own past, of choices made and prices paid, of the long road to finding peace with both God and himself. "Reckon it's not the scars need forgiving," he said slowly. "Those marks you carry, they're not your sin. They're witness to what was done to you, not by you." He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "The good book says we're marked as his own. Sometimes those marks come through suffering we didn't choose. Doesn't make them any less holy." Louisa's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed different from her earlier fearful weeping. "My father used to say something similar," she whispered, "before he died. But I'd forgotten, somehow. In all that darkness, I forgot." "Truth has a way of coming back to us," Marcus said softly, "like spring after winter." They sat quietly then, watching the fire dance. Outside, an owl called softly in the gathering dusk, and somewhere far off, a wolf answered. Marcus kept his rifle close, knowing the danger was far from past, but for just this moment, peace seemed to settle over the cabin like a blanket of fresh snow. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls as Marcus considered their situation. The presence of the preacher's men changed everything. What had been a simple matter of offering shelter to someone in need had become something far more complicated. He knew enough about frontier justice to understand that legal papers, even false ones, could cause serious trouble, and if the preacher had local authorities convinced of his righteousness. But watching Louisa as she dozed in the firelight, her face finally peaceful, Marcus knew he couldn't do anything else. Whatever came, he would stand as her protector. The thought of her being dragged back to that life of abuse and false piety made his blood run cold. No, he would find a way to keep her safe, no matter what papers the preacher produced. He checked his weapons one final time before settling in for another night of watchful waiting. The snow had begun falling again, softly now, as if nature herself was trying to cover their tracks from those who would do them harm. The morning dawned bitter cold, frost patterns etching the cabin's single window pane. Marcus stood at his rough-hewn table, counting out the last of their supplies. The flour sack held barely enough for 2 more days of bread. Their coffee was down to grounds. "We'll need to go into town," he said finally, turning to where Louisa sat mending a torn sleeve. "Can't put it off any longer." She looked up sharply, her needle freezing mid-stitch. "But the preacher's men—" "Might be there," Marcus agreed. "But we need supplies, and information too. Need to know what we're facing." Louisa's fingers twisted in the fabric. "I could stay here while you go." Marcus shook his head. "Too dangerous to leave you alone. If they found the cabin—" He let the words hang. "Better you stay close where I can protect you." Though fear shadowed her face, Louisa nodded. She trusted him. That simple fact humbled Marcus more than he could say. He spent the next hour preparing for the journey. The snow lay deep between his cabin and town, too deep for the mule to manage alone. Marcus hitched Old Bess to his small wood sled, laying fresh hay in the bottom for warmth. He wrapped Louisa in his spare coat and both woolen blankets, then helped her settle onto the sled. "Ain't much for comfort," he apologized, checking the ropes one final time. "I don't mind," Louisa said softly. "Been a long time since anyone cared enough to keep me warm." The word struck Marcus's heart like a physical blow. He patted her shoulder gently, then took up Bess's lead rope. "Let's get moving before the sun climbs too high." The journey was slow, the sled runners creaking through knee-deep snow. Marcus walked beside Bess, guiding her carefully around the worst drifts. The winter silence lay thick around them, broken only by the mule's labored breathing and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Louisa huddled under the blankets, her face half hidden but her eyes alert, scanning the white-draped forest. Once, a branch cracked sharply in the distance, and she grabbed Marcus's sleeve in panic. But it was only a snow-laden limb giving way to winter's weight. They reached town near midday. Marcus helped Louisa down from the sled, steadying her as her legs found their strength again. Already he could feel the stares, winter-bound townfolk pausing in their tasks to watch the mountain man and his companion. "Keep close," he murmured, and Louisa pressed against his side as they made their way toward the general store. They hadn't gone 10 steps when boot heels crunched behind them. Marcus turned slowly, positioning himself between Louisa and the approaching figure. "Morning, Deputy Hollis," Marcus said evenly. The deputy's hand rested meaningfully on his gun belt. His eyes flicked between Marcus and Louisa, narrow with suspicion. "McCord, heard tell you might be harboring someone of interest." "Harboring?" Marcus kept his voice calm, though he felt Louisa trembling against his back. "Miss Kincaid came to my cabin half frozen. Christian duty says help those in need." Deputy Hollis's mouth tightened. "Christian duty's one thing, harboring a runaway's another. Reverend Blackthorn's been asking after her. Says she belongs rightful under his protection." "I don't belong to him," Louisa burst out, her voice shaking but determined. "He has no right—" "Got papers says different," the deputy cut in. "Legal documents naming him your guardian after your father passed. Marriage license too, I hear." Marcus felt his jaw clench. "What law says a man can claim ownership of another soul?" "Show me that statute, deputy." Hollis shifted uncomfortably. "Ain't about ownership exactly. More about property rights, responsibilities, papers and such." He wouldn't meet Marcus's eyes. "Just giving fair warning, Reverend's got influence with the circuit judge. Might be better for all if the girl returns willing-like." "She ain't going back," Marcus said flatly. "Not to abuse hidden behind false piety." The deputy's face hardened. "Watch yourself, McCord. Law's got long arms, even up in them mountains of yours." He touched his hat brim curtly and walked away, boots crunching in the snow. Marcus felt Louisa's fingers dig into his arm. "He'll tell the preacher where to find us." "Likely so," Marcus agreed quietly. "Come on, let's get what we need and head back quick as we can." They hurried into the general store. The shopkeeper's wife watched them with worried eyes as Marcus quickly gathered their supplies: flour, coffee, salt, ammunition for his rifle. He could feel the weight of stairs through the windows. New word was already spreading. Louisa stood close beside him, head down, trying to make herself smaller. The store bell jingled as another customer entered. She flinched at the sound, pressing closer to Marcus's side. The shopkeeper's wife wrapped their purchases carefully, adding an extra packet of sugar without charging for it. Her eyes met Marcus's briefly, full of concern she couldn't voice openly. He nodded slightly in gratitude. Loading the supplies onto the sled took only minutes. Marcus helped Louisa back onto the hay, tucking the blankets around her with extra care. Her face was pale, her eyes huge with fear. "Hold fast," he murmured. "We'll be home soon." The return journey seemed longer, though Marcus set as quick a pace as best could manage. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Marcus hurried to get Louisa inside and the fire built up. Only when the door was barred and the windows shuttered did some of the tension leave Louisa's shoulders. She helped him put away the supplies, her movements automatic, mind clearly elsewhere. "What will we do?" she asked finally, standing by the fire with her arms wrapped tight around herself. "The deputy said the preacher has influence with the judge. If they come with papers—" Marcus set another log on the fire, watching the sparks rise. "Papers don't make truth," he said slowly. "Man can write any claim he pleases. Don't make it right in God's eyes." He straightened, meeting her worried gaze. "I swear to you, Louisa, no false claim will stand, not while I draw breath." Tears welled in her eyes. Without a word, she stepped closer and laid her head against his arm. Marcus stayed very still, touched by this simple show of trust from one who had known so little of it. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the lonely sound of coyotes calling in the distance. Marcus knew the preacher's reach was long, knew they faced hard times ahead. But looking down at Louisa's bowed head, feeling her quiet gratitude, he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would find a way to keep her safe. They stood together by the fire's warmth, while outside the winter night drew its dark curtain across the mountains. The danger wasn't past. Far from it. But for this moment at least, they had shelter, supplies, and each other's trust to sustain them. Marcus gently touched Louisa's shoulder. "Best get some rest. Been a long day." She nodded, raising her head. Though fear still lingered in her eyes, there was something else there too, a spark of determination that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing with me today, for everything." Marcus simply nodded, watching as she moved to her pallet by the fire. He took his usual place in the chair by the door, rifle across his knees. The night would be long, but he would keep watch, as he had every night since Providence had brought her to his door. The fire settled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin's walls. Marcus listened to Louisa's breathing even out as she drifted to sleep, while outside the wind sang its winter song through the pines. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight at least they were safe, warm, and not alone. The days following their trip to town settled into a watchful routine. Marcus knew they couldn't hide forever, but he was determined to make Louisa as self-reliant as possible while they had time. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when he led her to the shed behind the cabin. "First lesson," he said, pulling out lengths of wire. "Setting snares. Might not seem important now, but knowing how to get food could save your life someday." Louisa watched intently as his weathered hands shaped the wire into loops. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Show me again," she said when he finished. "I want to learn it right." Marcus demonstrated the technique several more times, explaining each step. Wire needs to be just so, not too tight, not too loose. Rabbit comes along, sticks his head in, and... He made a quick gesture. "I understand." Louisa took the wire, her fingers trembling slightly but determined. Her first attempt was clumsy, but she didn't give up. By the third try, she had shaped a passable snare. "Good," Marcus nodded. "Now for placing them. Follow me." They trudged through the snow to where rabbit tracks crossed beneath low branches. Marcus showed her how to spot the best locations, natural pathways where animals were likely to pass. Louisa set her snares carefully, marking each spot with a broken twig so they could find them again. "You're a quick study," Marcus said as they headed back. "I have to be." Louisa's voice was quiet but firm. "I won't be helpless anymore. Won't be a burden to you." "You ain't a burden," Marcus said gruffly, "but learning to provide for yourself, that's good sense for anyone." Next came lessons in chopping kindling. Marcus showed her how to split the smaller logs safely, keeping her fingers well away from the axe blade. Louisa's first swings were tentative, but she soon found her rhythm. By midday, she had a respectable pile of kindling stacked against the cabin wall. "My arms ache," she admitted, rubbing her shoulders. "But it feels good, doing honest work." Marcus understood. Physical labor had its own kind of healing. It tired the body but settled the mind. He saw it in the way Louisa held herself straighter now, more confident despite her wariness. The days fell into a pattern. Mornings were for practical lessons, tracking, fire building, basic repairs. Afternoons, Louisa helped with whatever tasks needed doing, from mending clothes to preparing meals. She threw herself into every chore with quiet determination, refusing to let her fears keep her idle. One evening, as the sun painted the snow in shades of pink and gold, Marcus found an old Bible in his trunk of keepsakes. The leather was cracked, the pages yellow with age, but the words were still clear. He settled into his chair by the fire, turning to a familiar passage. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read slowly, his voice rough but reverent. "I shall not want." As he read, a soft sound joined his words. Louisa had begun to sing, her voice barely above a whisper at first. It was an old hymn, one Marcus remembered from childhood church meetings. The melody rose and fell like a gentle stream, filling the cabin with something that had been missing for too long. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me. Marcus's voice trailed off as Louisa continued singing. Though her voice trembled, there was strength in it too. The strength of faith tested, but not broken. The firelight caught the tears on her cheeks, but she sang on, each verse steadier than the last. When the final note faded, Marcus bowed his head. Words of prayer came easier than they had in years, flowing from some deep well he'd thought long dry. "Lord," he whispered, "watch over this child of yours. Give her strength to face what's coming, and thank you for sending her to my door." Louisa's quiet amen joined his. For a long moment, they sat in peaceful silence. The fire crackled softly, and outside an owl called across the darkening valley. It felt almost like family, Marcus thought, this sharing of faith and quiet companionship. Morning broke clear and cold. Marcus saddled his mule early, meaning to check his trap lines before the day grew too warm. "Stay close to the cabin," he told Louisa. "I won't be gone long." She nodded, already busy with morning chores. "I'll have coffee waiting when you return." The winter air stung Marcus's face as he rode out. Fresh snow had fallen in the night, making tracking easier. He'd checked 3 traps, finding 2 empty and 1 with a plump rabbit, when movement caught his eye. Far across the valley, thin columns of smoke rose against the pale sky. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Those weren't the friendly fires of honest travelers. He'd seen enough campfires in his life to know the difference. These were hunting fires, meant for warming men who'd been riding hard and sleeping rough. The preacher's men closing in. He turned Bess toward home, pushing the mule faster than was strictly wise in the deep snow. His mind raced ahead to the cabin, to Louisa. They'd known this was coming, but the reality of it still hit hard. Louisa was waiting at the door when he arrived, reading his expression instantly. "They're coming, aren't they?" Marcus dismounted, leading Bess to the shed. Saw smoke across the valley. 3, maybe 4 campfires. They're working their way up systematic-like, searching every hollow and homestead. "How long?" Her voice was steady, though her hands twisted in her apron. "Day, maybe 2 at most." Marcus began checking his weapons: rifle, pistol, hunting knife, each clean, loaded, ready. You should stay inside, out of sight. If they come while I'm not here, no. Louisa's voice was firm. I won't hide anymore. These scars? She pushed up her sleeve, showing the marks that had so horrified him that first morning. They're proof I survived. Proof of what that man truly is, no matter what his papers say. Her chin lifted. I'll stand with you, Marcus. Whatever comes. Marcus looked at her, really looked. Gone was the half-frozen woman he'd found in the snow. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd found her own kind of courage. It humbled him, that transformation. All right, he said softly. We'll face it together then. But first, let's get more wood split and stored. Might be we'll need to stay close to home for a spell. They worked through the morning, stacking firewood and checking their supplies. Louisa moved with purpose, her fear still visible but no longer controlling her. Once, she paused to look out across the snow-covered valley where threads of smoke still rose. I used to pray for rescue, she said quietly. For someone to see past the preacher's fine words to what he really was. I never expected... She glanced at Marcus. Never expected God would lead me to a mountain man's cabin, or that I'd find more true faith here than in all the preacher's sermons. Marcus wasn't sure how to answer that. He just nodded and went back to work, but her words stayed with him. God did work in mysterious ways, bringing a battered soul to his door, wakening his own buried faith, giving them both a chance at something like redemption. As the sun began to set, they brought in the last armload of wood. The cabin was as ready as they could make it, food stored, water drawn, defenses prepared. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together. Louisa built up the fire while Marcus made his usual evening check of the cabin's perimeter. When he returned, she had coffee waiting, just as she'd promised that morning. They sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance. Thank you, Louisa said suddenly, for teaching me things, for treating me like I'm worth something. You are worth something, Marcus said gruffly. Don't ever let any man tell you different. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. I'm starting to believe that, starting to see myself the way you do, scars and all. Outside, a coyote's lonely call echoed across the darkening valley. Marcus added another log to the fire, watching the sparks rise. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but tonight they had this moment of peace, this shared understanding of what truly mattered. Louisa began humming softly, another hymn, but not a sad one this time. It spoke of courage and faith, of light overcoming darkness. Marcus found himself humming along, his deep voice harmonizing with her lighter one. The music filled the cabin, pushing back the gathering night, making their shelter feel more than ever like home. Marcus stood at his workbench, methodically pressing powder into brass cartridge cases. The morning light streamed through the cabin's single window, catching dust motes in its pale beam. He'd been thinking about their defenses since dawn, turning over possibilities in his mind. Louisa, he called softly. Come here a spell. There's something you need to learn. She approached cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron. The smell of fresh biscuits followed her from the cooking hearth. What is it? Time you learned about cartridges. Marcus picked up an empty brass case, holding it where she could see. Powder goes in first, then the bullet gets seated just so. Too loose, it won't fire true. Too tight, it might jam. Louisa's hands trembled slightly as she took the cartridge he offered. I never thought I'd need to know such things. Pray God you won't. Marcus's voice was gentle. But knowledge ain't never a burden. Watch close now. He demonstrated each step carefully, measuring powder, seating bullets, checking the finished rounds. Louisa paid careful attention, though her fingers shook at first. By the 10th cartridge, her movements were steadier, more confident. Good, Marcus nodded. You're a quick study. He turned to a wooden box on the shelf, drawing out something wrapped in oiled cloth. Unwrapping it revealed a small pistol, a pocket derringer, well-maintained but showing honest wear. This was my mother's. he said quietly. Carried it all her days on the frontier. Never had to use it, thank the Lord, but knowing she could gave her peace of mind. Louisa stared at the weapon, her face pale. I don't know if I could. Better to have it and not need it, Marcus said firmly, than need it and not have it. He showed her how to load it, how to cock the hammer, where to place her fingers. Keep it in your pocket. Just knowing it's there might steady your nerve. She nodded slowly, accepting the pistol with careful hands. It disappeared into her skirt pocket, but Marcus could see how the weight of it troubled her. There's another kind of defense we need to think on, he said, changing the subject. One that might serve us better than bullets. He moved to his trunk, pulling out paper, pen, and ink. We need to put some things in writing. To his surprise, Louisa's face brightened. I can help with that. My father taught me letters before he passed, said education was a gift no one could take away. Marcus spread the papers on the table, pulling his chair closer. That's Providence speaking plain. I can write well enough for trapping contracts, but legal papers need a finer hand. Louisa sat beside him, taking up the pen with surprising confidence. Her grip was sure, practiced. She made a few test strokes, the nib flowing smoothly across the paper. What should we write first? She asked. Start with a homestead claim, Marcus said. I've been meaning to file one proper like for years. Never seemed important before. He watched as she began writing, her letters flowing neat and clear. Then we'll draft statements about the preacher's doings. Everything you can remember, dates, places, witnesses, if any. Louisa's hand paused only briefly before continuing. There were others, she said quietly. Girls who disappeared after a while. And his men, they kept ledgers of money paid, though they called it donations. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Write it all. Every detail you can recall. Names especially. Folks he wronged might still be found to speak truth. Through the morning and into afternoon, they worked steadily. Louisa's pen scratched across page after page, recording dates, places, events. She wrote with a schoolteacher's precision, each letter perfectly formed. Sometimes her hand would shake when recording particularly painful memories, but she never stopped. Marcus marveled at her determination. Here was a weapon the preacher hadn't counted on, the very education he'd likely scorned in his servants. Louisa's literacy might prove their salvation in court. Your writing's as neat as any clerk's, he commented during a break for coffee. Louisa smiled faintly. Papa was proud of my penmanship, said a person's writing should show respect for those reading it. Her eyes grew distant. He taught school back east before coming west. Always said education was a light in dark places. He was right about that. Marcus watched as she began a fresh page. These papers might be the light we need. They worked through the afternoon, stopping only when the light grew too dim for writing. Marcus lit the lamp while Louisa flexed her ink-stained fingers. I'll make copies of everything, she said, reaching for fresh paper, in case anything happens to the first set. Marcus nodded approval, stoking the fire to give her more light. The lamp cast a warm glow over the table where she worked, catching golden highlights in her hair. Her face showed intense concentration as she copied each document carefully. Looking at her bent over her work, Marcus felt something stir in his chest. Pride in her courage, yes, but something else too. Something warmer, more tender. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on practical matters. I'll need to ride into town soon, he said, checking his powder horn. File these papers proper like with the land office and the circuit judge if he's about. Louisa's pen paused. Will it be safe? Safe enough in daylight, Marcus assured her. Town's got its share of God-fearing folks who won't stand for false preaching once they know the truth. Just need to get these papers to the right hands. She nodded, returning to her copying. The scratch of her pen filled the comfortable silence between them. Outside, wind sighed through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its mate. Marcus checked his weapons one last time, then settled in his chair to watch Louisa work. The lamplight caught the determination in her face, the steady purpose in her movements. She was no longer the frightened creature he'd found in the snow. Education and honest work had awakened something stronger in her, something that had been there all along, just waiting for the chance to shine. Page by careful page, they were building their defense, not with bullets and powder, though those might still be needed, but with truth set down in clear, careful letters. It was a different kind of ammunition, but perhaps more powerful in the end. Louisa finished another page, setting it aside to dry. Her fingers were stained with ink, but her eyes were bright with purpose. "We'll need to cite specific laws," she said thoughtfully. "Papa always said that in America, even the humblest person has rights under law. We just have to prove them." Marcus nodded, adding another log to the fire. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they had hope. Hope built on courage, truth, and the steady scratch of a pen across paper. The last page was finally copied as the lamp began to gutter. Louisa sat back, flexing her cramped fingers. 2 neat stacks of documents lay before them, their armor against lies, their shield against false claims. "Best get some rest," Marcus said softly. "Tomorrow we'll check these over one last time. Then I'll ride to town." Louisa gathered the papers carefully, storing them in Marcus's trunk. Her hand brushed the small pistol in her pocket, a reminder of harsher realities, but her smile was steady. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing in me, for giving me a chance to fight back with truth instead of fear." Marcus only nodded, not trusting his voice. He watched as she banked the fire for the night, her movements sure and purposeful. Whatever came next, they faced it not as victim and protector, but as partners in a cause. That thought warmed him more than any fire could. Dawn crept over the mountains with fingers of pale gold. Marcus stood in the doorway of his cabin, adjusting the straps of his worn leather saddlebags. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, fighting back the morning chill. Their precious documents lay carefully folded in his coat pocket, close to his chest. Louisa hovered nearby, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. "The trail will be treacherous with all this ice," she said softly. "Perhaps we should wait another day." Marcus shook his head, checking the cinch on his mule's saddle one last time. "Can't afford to wait. Blackthorn's men are out there, and every day gives them more chance to spread their lies." He patted the pocket holding their papers. "Truth needs telling, and soon." The mule stamped its hooves in the crusty snow, breath steaming in the cold air. Marcus had chosen the sturdy animal over his horse, better footing on the icy trail down to town. "I'll be back before sundown," he promised, turning to Louisa. Her face was pale in the early light, worry etched around her eyes. "Keep the door barred. Don't open it for anyone but me." She nodded, then stepped forward suddenly, touching his arm. "Please be careful, Marcus. I couldn't bear it if—" Her voice caught. "Now none of that," he said gently. "I've rode these trails 20 winters. I'll be fine." But Louisa's fingers tightened on his sleeve. "It's not the trail I'm worried about. Blackthorn's men, they're ruthless. They'll do anything to keep those papers from reaching town." Marcus covered her hand with his own for a moment. "That's why they need to get there all the more. Trust in Providence, Louisa. Truth has a way of coming to light." She withdrew her hand slowly, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. "I'll pray for your safe return." Marcus mounted carefully, the mule shifting beneath him. "Keep that pistol close," he reminded her. "I'll knock 3 times when I return, like this." He demonstrated the pattern on his saddle horn. "Don't open otherwise, no matter what you hear." Louisa stood in the doorway, a lonely figure against the warm light within. Marcus touched his hat brim, then turned the mule toward the trail. The sound of hooves crunching in snow faded into the stillness of the winter morning. The path down from his cabin wound through stands of pine and aspen. Ice glazed the rocks and fallen logs, making the going slow. Marcus kept the mule to a steady pace, one eye on the trail and one on the surrounding forest. Every shadow among the trees could hide danger. By mid-morning, he'd reached the ridge that marked the halfway point to town. Here the trail narrowed, hemmed in by steep rocks on one side and a sharp drop on the other. Marcus dismounted to lead the mule through the worst stretch. The attack came without warning. A rope snapped tight across the trail, catching Marcus at chest height. He went down hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. Before he could roll to his feet, boots crunched in the snow around him. 3 men materialized from behind the rocks, faces masked by bandanas. "Well, look what we caught," one drawled, prodding Marcus with a boot toe. "Mountain man coming to town." Marcus reached for his pistol, but a kick sent it spinning away across the ice. Another boot caught him in the ribs. He curled instinctively, protecting his core as more blows rained down. "Reverend Blackthorn sends his regards," someone spat. "Says you're harboring his property." Marcus tried to surge upward, but a rifle butt cracked across his shoulders, driving him back into the snow. Through the haze of pain, he felt hands roughly searching his coat. "Here they are, the papers. Tear 'em up, make sure none of his lies reach town." Marcus could only watch, half-conscious, as their carefully prepared documents were shredded and scattered to the wind. Bits of paper danced away like wounded birds, carrying their hopes with them. "That should teach him to meddle in a man of God's business," one of the men said. "Leave him. Cold'll finish what we started." Boot steps crunched away. Marcus lay in the bloodied snow, every breath stabbing through his chest. His mule had bolted during the attack, leaving him alone on the ridge. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his hands and knees. The world swam around him, trees and sky trading places. Blood dripped from his nose, staining the snow crimson. His ribs screamed as he forced himself upright, using a pine trunk for support. The sun had passed its peak. He had to get back, had to warn Louisa. One step at a time, he began the long journey up the mountain. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Louisa paced. She'd kept the fire fed, swept the floor twice, and reorganized their meager supplies. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spinning terrible scenarios. But as the afternoon light began to fade, her anxiety mounted. "Please, Lord," she whispered, adding another log to the fire. "Keep him safe. Bring him home." She'd lost track of how many times she'd prayed those words today. The cabin felt too quiet, too empty without Marcus's steady presence. Even the familiar creak of the settling logs seemed ominous now. Shadows lengthened across the snow outside. Still no sign of Marcus. Louisa lit the lamp, setting it in the window where its light might guide him home. Her hand strayed to the pistol in her pocket, drawing comfort from its solid weight. The first stars were appearing when she heard it, an uneven shuffling outside. Not the steady stride she knew so well. Louisa's heart leaped into her throat. "Marcus," she called softly, pressing against the door. "Is that you?" A grunt of pain answered her. Then, weakly, 3 distinct knocks. She threw the bar aside and yanked the door open. Marcus stood swaying in the darkness, one hand braced against the wall. His face was bruised and bloodied, his coat torn and caked with snow. "Dear God," Louisa breathed, rushing to support him as his legs gave way. Together they stumbled inside, Marcus's weight nearly bearing them both to the floor. "The papers," he gasped as she helped him collapse beside the hearth. "They took them, destroyed them all." His trembling fingers found her hand, clutching it desperately. "I'm sorry, Louisa. I failed you." "Hush," she soothed, tears streaming down her face as she knelt beside him. "You're alive. That's what matters." She ran gentle hands over his injuries, assessing the damage. "They could have killed you." "Maybe they should have," he whispered. "Without those papers." "No!" Louisa's voice was fierce. "Don't say that. We'll find another way." She began cleaning his wounds with water from the kettle, her touch tender but determined. "God didn't bring us this far to abandon us now." Marcus's eyes were glazed with pain and defeat. "How can you still have such faith?" "Because I have to," she answered simply. "And because you taught me that strength isn't just in fists or guns. It's in here." She touched his chest, over his heart. "We'll write new papers, better ones. As many times as it takes." Her quiet determination seemed to reach him. His breathing steadied slightly, though pain still lined his face. "You're something else, Louisa Kincaid," he murmured. "Reckon I should have listened when you wanted me to wait." "Reckon you should have," she agreed, the ghost of a smile touching her lips as she continued tending his injuries. But what's done is done. Right now, you need rest and healing. She helped him to the bed, easing him down despite his protests about taking her sleeping place. "Don't argue with me, Marcus McCord," she said firmly. "You're in no shape for gallantry." Once he was settled, she built up the fire and set water to heat for willow bark tea. The familiar tasks helped calm her racing heart, though anger still burned deep inside at what had been done to him. "We'll get through this," she said softly, more to herself than to Marcus. "Somehow, we'll find a way." Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin, determination glowed as warm as the firelight. They had lost this battle, but Louisa's spirit remained unbroken. She watched over Marcus as he finally drifted into exhausted sleep, her mind already turning to what they would do next. Their papers were gone, but their will to fight remained. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, at least, they were together and alive. For now, that would have to be enough. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-laden pines in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Marcus lay on the narrow bed, every breath a reminder of yesterday's beating. His ribs ached fiercely, and bruises had darkened across his chest and face overnight. Louisa moved quietly around the cabin, stoking the fire and preparing willow bark tea. She'd slept little, keeping watch from the chair beside his bed. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her movements remained gentle and sure as she tended to him. "You need to rest," Marcus protested weakly as she changed the cold compress on his forehead. "I'll rest when you're better," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "Now drink this tea. It'll help with the pain." He managed a few sips before falling back against the pillow, exhausted by even that small effort. Louisa's hand lingered on his shoulder, offering comfort through touch when words felt inadequate. The morning light strengthened, filtering through frost-covered windows. Louisa had just set a pot of beans to simmer when she heard it, the crunch of multiple boots in snow approaching the cabin. Her heart stuttered. She crossed quickly to the window, peering out through a clear patch in the frost. 4 men on horseback were dismounting in the yard, their breath clouding in the cold air. She recognized their heavy coats and the way they moved. The preacher's men. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, backing away from the window. "They're here." He struggled to sit up, face contorting in pain. "The pistol," he gasped. "Get the pistol." But before Louisa could reach for the weapon, the door burst inward with a tremendous crash. Wood splintered around the lock as 3 men forced their way inside, bringing a blast of cold air with them. "There she is," one of them growled, pointing at Louisa. "Grab her." She tried to run to reach the back room, but rough hands seized her arms. She kicked and struggled, terror lending her strength. "No, let me go." "Marcus!" she screamed as they began dragging her toward the door. "Please help me." Marcus thrashed on the bed, trying desperately to rise. His face was a mask of agony and desperation as he fought against his injured body. "Leave her be," he roared, but the effort sent him into a fit of coughing that left him gasping. "Can't do that," one of the men sneered. "Reverend Blackthorne wants his property back. Nothing personal." Louisa's screams echoed off the cabin walls as they hauled her outside. She fought like a wild thing, leaving scratches on their faces and arms, but she couldn't break free. They lifted her onto a horse, binding her hands to the saddle horn. Marcus finally managed to get his feet under him. Clutching his ribs, he staggered toward the door, using the wall for support. But by the time he reached the threshold, the riders were already moving away, Louisa's cries growing fainter in the distance. "No," he whispered, stumbling out into the snow. "Please, no." His legs gave way and he fell to his knees in the yard. The sound of hoofbeats faded, leaving only the hollow whisper of wind through the pines. Fresh snow was already beginning to fill in the tracks, erasing all trace of their passage. Tears froze on Marcus's cheeks as he knelt there, body shaking with cold and grief. The magnitude of his failure crushed down on him like an avalanche. He had promised to protect her, sworn that no one would hurt her again, and now she was gone, taken back to the very evil she had fled. "I'm sorry," he choked out, though there was no one left to hear. "God forgive me. I'm sorry." The effort of moving had reopened some of his wounds. Blood spotted the snow beneath him, bright crimson against white. Still, he couldn't bring himself to move, to acknowledge that this was real and not some fever dream. Only when numbness began creeping into his limbs did survival instinct force him back inside. He collapsed in his chair by the fire, which had burned down to sullen coals. The cabin felt vast and empty without Louisa's presence. Her half-finished cup of tea still sat on the table, growing cold. Hours passed. Darkness gathered outside as Marcus sat motionless, staring into the dying fire. He had failed her, failed himself, failed God. The weight of it threatened to crush what remained of his spirit. His eyes fell on the old Bible, lying where Louisa had left it the night before. With trembling hands, he pulled it into his lap, letting it fall open randomly. The pages were worn with age, corners soft from years of turning. "Lord," he whispered hoarsely, "I ain't fit to open your word. Everything I touch turns to ash. I couldn't even protect one innocent soul you sent to my door." Tears fell onto the yellowed pages as he continued his broken confession. "I thought I was strong enough, thought I could stand against evil, but I'm nothing, just a broken old man living alone in the hills." The silence that followed seemed to mock him, but then, faint as morning mist, he heard it, an echo of Louisa's voice, singing the hymns she'd shared during their evenings together. The memory was so clear it made his heart ache. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. He could see her sitting by the fire, face lifted in song despite her fears. Could hear the tremor in her voice slowly steadying as she gained confidence. Her faith had never wavered, even in the darkest moments. That saved a wretch like me. Marcus's hands tightened on the Bible. Something stirred in his chest, a spark in the ashes of his despair. Louisa had survived so much already. She had found the courage to flee her captors once before, but this time she wouldn't have to fight alone. "Lord," he prayed, voice growing stronger, "I know I ain't worthy. Know I've failed time and again. But please, if you've ever listened to the prayers of a sinner, hear me now. Give me strength. Show me the way. Don't let evil triumph over good." He drew a shuddering breath, ribs protesting the movement. "I ain't asking for myself. That girl has more faith in her little finger than I've had in my whole life. She deserves better than what men like me and that false preacher have brought her. Please, Lord, help me make this right." As if in answer, the fire popped and sparked, sending up a shower of embers. Marcus watched them rise, glowing like stars against the darkness. Slowly, purpose began to fill the hollow places grief had carved inside him. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo his failures, but he could choose what to do next. Could choose to let this defeat break him completely, or use it as fuel for something stronger. Louisa's words came back to him. Strength isn't just in fists or guns, it's in here. She had touched his heart when she said that, believing in him even when he doubted himself. Marcus set the Bible aside and began to pray in earnest, not with the formal words he'd learned as a child, but with the raw honesty of a desperate soul. He prayed for Louisa's safety, for guidance, for the strength to do what needed doing. Most of all, he prayed for the courage to face whatever lay ahead. The night deepened around him, but the darkness no longer felt quite so absolute. His injuries still pained him, but purpose burned brighter than physical discomfort. Evil might have won this battle, but Marcus McCord was far from defeated. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For now, he let prayer and determination fill him, building like a slow-burning fire. Somewhere out there, Louisa needed him, and this time, he would not fail her. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin windows, finding Marcus already awake. He hadn't slept much, spending the night in prayer and preparation. His body ached, but determination burned brighter than pain. Carefully, he unwrapped the blood-stained bandages around his ribs. The bruises had deepened to purple, but the swelling had gone down some. He bound fresh cloth tightly around his chest, gritting his teeth against the pressure. The familiar weight of his rifle brought comfort as he strapped it across his back. At the door, he paused to run a whetstone along his axe blade. The steady scraping sound filled the quiet morning air. Each stroke was deliberate, focused, like a meditation. Lord, he prayed aloud, voice rough from the night's vigil, keep Louisa safe until I find her, and give me strength, not just for fighting, but for facing what needs facing. His mule stamped impatiently in the yard, breath steaming in the cold. Marcus mounted carefully, favoring his injured side. Fresh snow had fallen in the night, but the tracks leading from his cabin were still visible. 3 horses heading east toward town. The sun climbed higher as he followed their trail, casting long shadows across the white landscape. His mule picked its way carefully down the mountain paths. Every jolt sent pain through Marcus's ribs, but he pressed on. Near mid-morning he heard voices ahead. 2 men on horseback emerged from a stand of pine trees, Thomas Avery and Ben Caro, local ranchers he recognized from town. They reined up short when they saw him. "McCord?" Thomas called out, surprised. "Thought you kept to yourself up in the hills these days." "Usually do," Marcus answered, "but times change when evil men need facing." Ben's expression darkened. "You mean Reverend Blackthorn, don't you? Saw his men riding through at dawn, had a girl with them." Marcus nodded grimly. "He's no reverend, just a wolf in shepherd's clothing. You 2 knew him before, didn't you?" The ranchers exchanged uneasy looks. Thomas shifted in his saddle, suddenly finding the snow interesting. "Knew him, yeah. Saw things we ain't proud of staying quiet about." "He threatened our families," Ben added bitterly. "Said he'd take our land with some legal tricks if we spoke against him. Man's got papers for everything, true or false." "Others?" Marcus asked. "Must be more who've suffered under him." Thomas nodded slowly. "Sarah Miller's girl. Jenkins' family lost their farm. Widow Conway's boy got beat so bad he still walks with a limp. But folks are scared, Marcus. Man's got influence with the law." "Truth needs speaking," Marcus said firmly. "Evil grows stronger in silence. That girl he took, Louisa, she's already survived more hurt than anyone should bear, but she found the courage to run. Least we can do is find courage to stand with her." The ranchers were quiet for a long moment, wrestling with their consciences. Finally, Ben straightened in his saddle. "Reckon you're right, McCord. Can't keep letting fear rule us." "I'm with you too," Thomas said. "About time somebody stood up to that devil. My Emma would never forgive me if I rode away from this." Relief and gratitude warmed Marcus's chest. "Much obliged, both of you. Might need your testimony before this is done." The 3 men turned their mounts toward town. The winter sun tracked across the sky as they rode, sharing stories of Blackthorn's cruelty and corruption. Each tale strengthened Marcus's resolve. Dusk was falling when they finally caught sight of the town's lights glowing in the valley below. Marcus felt the weight of what lay ahead settling on his shoulders. Somewhere down there, Louisa was being held against her will. Somewhere down there, a false preacher needed facing. "You ready for this, McCord?" Thomas asked quietly. Marcus touched the rifle at his side, then the Bible in his saddlebag. "Ready as prayer can make me. Evil's had its way too long in these parts." They rode on through the gathering darkness, 3 men united in purpose. Marcus's wounds still pained him, but his spirit was stronger than it had been in years. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. Marcus rode into town with Thomas Avery and Ben Caro flanking him. The evening air hung heavy with wood smoke from chimneys, and lamplight spilled from frost-covered windows. Their horses' hooves crunched in the snow as they made their way down the main street. Near the church, they spotted Blackthorn's distinctive black wagon. 2 armed men stood guard while a 3rd tended a small fire. Marcus's heart clenched when he heard muffled sounds coming from inside the wagon. Louisa's voice, though he couldn't make out the words. "Steady now," Thomas murmured as they dismounted. People began emerging from shops and homes, drawn by the unusual sight of Marcus McCord in town with company. Marcus strode toward the wagon, ignoring the warning looks from Blackthorn's men. "Release her," he called out, voice carrying in the crisp air. "You've no right to hold her against her will." Reverend Blackthorn emerged from the church, his long black coat sweeping behind him. A cold smile played across his face as he approached. No, right? I beg to differ, Mr. McCord. He pulled papers from his coat, the ones stolen during the ambush. These documents grant me legal guardianship of my ward. The law stands with me. More townspeople gathered, forming a loose circle. Deputy Hollis pushed through the crowd, hand resting on his holstered pistol. Now, Marcus, don't make trouble. Reverend's got his papers in order. Papers bought with violence, Marcus replied evenly. Or do you reckon those bruises your Reverend's men gave me were God's will? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marcus turned to address them directly. Good folks, you know me. I've kept to myself these years, never asked anything of anyone. But I can't stay silent while evil wears a preacher's collar and twists the law to hurt the innocent. Thomas Avery stepped forward, hat in hand. He speaks truth. My wife and I lost our first farm to Blackthorn's schemes. He threatened our children when we tried to fight back. Same with my family, Ben Caro added. Man's got a trail of broken lives behind him, all hidden behind false papers and fine words. The deputy shifted uncomfortably, looking between Marcus and Blackthorn. These are serious accusations. Lies and slander, Blackthorn snapped, but his composed mask was slipping. I have legal authority. Let her speak. Marcus's quiet words cut through the preacher's bluster. Let Louisa tell her own truth. Inside the wagon, the sounds of movement grew louder. One of Blackthorn's men moved to block the door, but Louisa's voice rang out clear and strong. I want to speak. After a tense moment, Deputy Hollis nodded. Let her out. Woman's got a right to be heard. The guard reluctantly opened the wagon door. Louisa emerged slowly, her face pale but determined in the gathering dusk. She stood straight despite her trembling hands. That marriage license bearing Joseph McCord's name, she said, voice carrying across the hushed crowd. Reverend Blackthorn forced me to sign it under threat of worse beatings. No marriage ever took place. She pushed up her sleeves, revealing the scars that crossed her arms. These are his true papers, written in my flesh when I refused his advances. Gasps and angry mutters rose from the townsfolk. Women pulled children closer, men's faces hardened with disgust. Deputy Hollis stared at the scars, the color draining from his face. Lies, Blackthorn roared. His hand darted inside his coat and emerged with a pistol. She's my ward, my property. No human being is property, Marcus said firmly. Not by God's law or man's. The deputy's hand tightened on his own weapon. Reverend, lower that pistol. But Blackthorn's eyes had taken on a wild gleam. The mask of piety had cracked completely, revealing the rage beneath. You'll not take what's mine, he snarled, swinging the gun toward Louisa. None of you will. She ain't yours, Marcus said. Never was. Truth's been spoken. Town's heard it. Now lower that weapon before someone gets hurt. The crowd had drawn back, leaving Blackthorn increasingly isolated. His men looked uncertain, no longer sure of their position. The deputy drew his pistol, but kept it pointed at the ground. Town's made its choice, Reverend, Deputy Hollis said quietly. Best you come peaceful-like. Blackthorn's hand trembled on his pistol as he looked around at the faces of the townspeople, faces that now showed judgment instead of fear. The truth had finally emerged, and there was no hiding from it anymore. The crowd erupted in shouts and gasps as Blackthorn's pistol wavered between Louisa and Marcus. Women pulled their children behind them while men stepped forward, tension crackling through the evening air like lightning before a storm. Marcus stood his ground, rifle held low against his leg. The weight of the weapon felt heavy in his hands, not just its physical burden, but the weight of choice it represented. The crowd fell silent, watching, waiting to see what he would do. You won't shoot anyone, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the town square. Each word came slow and deliberate, like he was laying down stones in a path. Put it down, Reverend. There's been enough hurt already. Blackthorn's eyes blazed with fury. You dare preach to me? I am God's servant. His finger tightened on the trigger. No. Marcus shook his head slowly. You serve only yourself. He lowered his rifle completely, letting it rest against his leg. I won't shed blood here. Justice belongs to God, not me. The preacher's hand trembled. Confusion flickered across his face at Marcus's refusal to fight. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, ready to snap. Then something changed in the air. Marcus's quiet strength seemed to flow outward, touching the gathered townspeople. They saw the mountain man choosing peace even with violence threatened, and it moved them to action. Several men surged forward at once. Jack Turner, the blacksmith, grabbed Blackthorn's gun arm while young Will Harper seized his other arm. The preacher's pistol discharged harmlessly into the dirt as they wrestled it from his grip. "Get him!" someone shouted, and more townspeople rushed in. Blackthorn's men, seeing their leader overwhelmed, backed away with their hands raised. The preacher thrashed and cursed as he was forced to his knees in the snow. Deputy Hollis stepped forward, drawing his handcuffs. His voice rang with newfound authority. "Reverend Silas Blackthorn, you're under arrest for fraud and assault." He looked at Louisa, then added firmly, "And whatever other charges come to light when we hear the full story." Louisa, who had been frozen in place throughout the confrontation, suddenly seemed to crumple. Her legs gave way, but Marcus was there, catching her before she fell. She collapsed against his chest, great sobs racking her body. Not tears of fear or pain this time, but of relief. Years of tension and terror flowed out with each shuddering breath. Marcus held her tightly, one hand gently stroking her hair. "It's over," he murmured. "You're free now. Your courage won the day, not my rifle. You stood up and spoke truth. That's what brought him down." The deputy and several men marched Blackthorn toward the jail, the preacher spitting curses and threats the whole way. His former guards slunk away, no longer willing to stand with him now that his true nature was exposed. The townspeople gathered around Marcus and Louisa, offering support and apologies for not seeing the truth sooner. Thomas Avery's wife brought a blanket to wrap around Louisa's shoulders. Ben Caro's daughter ran up with a cup of hot tea from the general store. "You both best come stay at our place tonight," Thomas offered. "Mary's got soup on the stove and spare beds made up." Marcus looked down at Louisa, who had finally stopped sobbing but still trembled against him. "What do you say? Might do us good to be among friends tonight." She nodded against his chest, then lifted her tear-stained face. "Thank you," she whispered, looking around at the townspeople. "All of you." The crowd began to disperse as the excitement died down. Marcus kept his arm around Louisa as they walked toward the Avery's house. The evening star had risen, bright and clear in the darkening sky. Behind them, lamplight spilled from the jailhouse where justice, delayed but not denied, was finally being served. The town's heart softened like spring snow in the days that followed. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid Louisa now appeared at the general store's door, arms laden with gifts. Sarah Miller brought a patchwork quilt her grandmother had made, while Betty Thompson arrived with fresh-baked bread and tears in her eyes. "We should have known better," Betty said, pressing Louisa's hand. "Should have looked closer at that preacher's claims." Louisa accepted their kindness with quiet grace. "The past is past," she would say, her voice gentle. "What matters is the truth came to light." Marcus spent his mornings at the land office filing new homestead papers. This time, half the town seemed eager to sign as witnesses, their names crowding the page in a testament to changed hearts. Even crusty old Judge Peters volunteered his signature, muttering about setting things right. In the afternoons, Louisa found herself welcomed at the schoolhouse. Miss Adelaide, the school marm, discovered Louisa's gift with children during a chance visit. Soon, Louisa was helping with reading lessons twice a week. The little ones gathered around her chair, captivated by her patient explanations and warm smile. Marcus worked steadily too, his strength returning as he repaired his mule's worn harness in the livery stable. The familiar task of working leather soothed him, each careful stitch a reminder that broken things could be made whole again. One evening they shared a simple supper in their rented room above Thompson's general store. Lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls as they ate cornbread and stew. Marcus set down his spoon, his expression thoughtful. "Been thinking," he said carefully, "about the cabin up there in the hills." Louisa looked up, waiting. "It's not much," Marcus continued. "But it could be a home. Real home, I mean." He met her eyes. Would you stay there? Not as someone needing shelter, but as family. Louisa's eyes filled with tears, but her smile shone brighter than the lamp's flame. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I would. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. The touch was gentle, a promise of protection freely given and gratefully received. Outside, the evening star rose over the town, blessing their choice to begin anew. The mountain air grew warmer as March yielded to April. Patches of earth emerged from beneath the melting snow like islands in a white sea. Marcus and Louisa guided their heavily laden mule up the familiar trail to the cabin, their borrowed wagon from town filled with supplies for their new life together. Look there. Louisa pointed to tiny purple crocuses pushing through the snow near the cabin's foundation. Spring is already welcoming us home. Marcus smiled at the word, home. It felt right now, not just shelter against the elements. They unloaded their provisions methodically. Sacks of flour and sugar, jars of preserved fruit from the townswomen, fresh seeds for planting, and new tools. The next morning, Marcus climbed onto the roof, replacing worn shingles while Louisa cleared a patch of earth near the door. She worked the soil with careful hands, planting the herbs she'd brought, sage, thyme, and mint. Their fragrances would soon grace their meals and teas. These will be good for healing too, she called up to Marcus. Her medical knowledge, learned from her father, would serve them well in the isolation of the mountains. When Marcus descended, Louisa offered him a slice of fresh bread she'd baked that morning. They sat on the cabin steps, sharing the warm loaf and laughing as crumbs fell into their laps. Their easy companionship felt as natural as breathing. In the evenings, lamplight filled the cabin with golden warmth. Louisa's clear voice carried the ancient words of scripture through the room while Marcus's knife-shaped wood into art. The small cross taking form under his careful hands would stand on their mantel, a symbol of their shared faith. One night, as Marcus set aside his carving, they spoke of Joseph. The pain in Marcus's voice was old, but healing. I pray he finds his way, he said quietly. As I have. Louisa touched his arm gently. The Lord can reach even the hardest heart, she reminded him. We'll pray for him together. Their life felt delicate yet strong, like the first spring shoots breaking through frost. The cabin that had once echoed with Marcus's solitude now hummed with shared purpose. Every small task, hanging fresh curtains, arranging their few books, setting the table for two, wove their lives more tightly together, transforming the mountain shack into the home they both had longed for. The evening sun painted the mountain peaks in amber and gold as Marcus trudged up the path, his arms aching from hours of splitting logs. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the cabin, where warm lamplight spilled through the window like honey. He paused at the threshold, struck by the sight before him. Louisa stood at the table, her hands working bread dough with smooth, practiced motions. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows, the lattice of scars clear in the lamp's glow. Yet there was no tension in her shoulders, no hurried attempt to hide the marks that had once brought such shame. Marcus felt his heart swell with a joy that brought tears to his eyes. Here was healing made visible, not in the fading of scars, but in Louisa's freedom from their power over her. Scars don't tell who you are, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Love does. Louisa looked up, tears gleaming in her own eyes, but her smile was radiant. Supper's nearly ready, she said softly. Outside, snow fell in gentle sweeps, but inside their home, warmth and laughter filled every corner. The lamplight caught the glint of tears on their cheeks, not tears of pain now, but of joy, of peace, of love, chosen and cherished. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.